Morgan Freeman's knees buckled and he collapsed right there on the stage at the Faith and Film Summit in Beverly Hills. His weathered face went ashen as Jonathan Roumie's gentle voice finished sharing a message he claimed Jesus had whispered to him personally just moments before. The packed auditorium of 1,800 industry professionals fell into stunned silence as the legendary actor crumpled into the chair behind him, tears streaming down his cheeks. Nobody expected this moment that would spark the most controversial spiritual awakening Hollywood had seen in decades. Jonathan rushed to Morgan's side immediately, his heart pounding as he knelt beside the trembling filmmaker. "Morgan, are you with me, brother?" Jonathan whispered, placing a steady hand on his shoulder while conference organizers quickly brought water and called for medical assistance. The entire crowd remained frozen, witnessing something profound unfolding before their eyes. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a cardiologist attending the summit, hurried onto the stage to check Morgan's vital signs. "His pulse is strong," she announced to the worried audience. "He appears to be experiencing emotional overwhelm rather than any medical emergency." Morgan nodded weakly, still unable to speak, his eyes fixed on Jonathan with an expression of wonder and disbelief. The festival moderator approached the microphone with gentle authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give these brothers some space while we ensure everyone is well. Perhaps we should take a brief intermission." But Morgan slowly raised his hand, shaking his head with determination despite his obvious emotional state. "No, please," he managed to whisper, his distinctive voice thick with emotion as he struggled to his feet with Jonathan's help. "Everyone needs to hear this. What Jonathan just shared with me," Morgan continued, his voice gaining strength, "it's the exact answer I've been desperately seeking from God for 6 months. The message he delivered contained details about my life that no human being could possibly know." The audience leaned forward, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. "3 days ago, I received a phone call that I thought would end my spiritual journey forever," Morgan revealed. "But what Jonathan told me, claiming it came directly from Jesus, addresses that crisis word for word. Private conversations, prayers I whispered alone, things only God could know." Jonathan stood pale beside his friend, realizing how God had used him for something beyond his understanding. "The most shocking part," Morgan continued, "is that this message contains the solution to a crisis that could destroy not just my career, but potentially damage the faith of millions who have trusted my voice." The silence was deafening. Morgan looked directly at Jonathan, tears flowing freely. "And Jonathan delivered this without knowing anything about my situation. He simply said, 'Morgan, Jesus wants you to hear this.'" What came next changed everything. To understand how this impossible moment happened, we need to go back to where this story really begins, to a friendship that started in the most unexpected way, and a secret that threatened to destroy everything Morgan thought he knew about his faith. To understand how this impossible moment came to pass, we need to go back to when these two men first crossed paths at a private prayer breakfast in Malibu 4 months earlier. Jonathan had been invited to speak about his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen, while Morgan attended quietly in the back corner, wrestling with the most devastating spiritual crisis of his 86-year life. Neither man knew how God was orchestrating their meeting for this exact moment. That morning in Malibu, Jonathan had felt an unusual stirring in his spirit during his prayer time before the breakfast. He'd been kneeling in his hotel room asking God for wisdom about his speaking engagement when he sensed a clear, almost audible message about someone in the audience who would need a very specific word of encouragement. The message was so detailed and personal that it initially made Jonathan uncomfortable, wondering if he was imagining things or if God was truly speaking something this precise. Meanwhile, Morgan had arrived at the breakfast carrying a secret that was slowly destroying him from the inside. 3 weeks earlier, he had received a phone call from a major television network executive with devastating news. They were threatening to pull his upcoming biblical documentary series, Voices of Eternity, from production after anonymous sources had leaked private recordings of Morgan expressing personal doubts about certain aspects of Christianity during what he thought were confidential conversations with close friends. The recordings revealed Morgan questioning everything from biblical miracles to the exclusivity of salvation through Christ honest spiritual wrestling that he had never intended for public consumption. But now, these private moments of vulnerability threatened to brand him as a hypocrite in the eyes of millions who had trusted his voice to guide them through sacred stories for decades. At the prayer breakfast, Morgan had chosen a seat in the far corner, hoping to avoid recognition while his heart battled with profound questions. How could he continue narrating biblical documentaries when his own faith felt so shaken? How could he be the voice of spiritual authority when he was drowning in uncertainty? The weight of potentially losing his life's most meaningful work had left him feeling spiritually adrift and questioning whether God could ever use someone with such deep doubts. When Jonathan took the stage that morning, he began sharing about the transformative experience of portraying Christ and how it had deepened his relationship with Jesus. But as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to the corner where Morgan sat, feeling an overwhelming urge to pray for this man he recognized but had never met. Something about Morgan's posture, the way his shoulders carried invisible weight, the distant look in his eyes, conveyed a spiritual hunger mixed with deep pain that Jonathan's heart immediately recognized. After the breakfast, Jonathan felt compelled to approach Morgan despite his natural shyness around established Hollywood legends. The Holy Spirit seemed to be pushing him forward with unusual urgency. "Excuse me, Mr. Freeman," he said respectfully, extending his hand. "I'm Jonathan Roumie. I just wanted to say that your narration work on biblical documentaries profoundly shaped my understanding of Scripture years before I ever dreamed of playing Jesus myself." Morgan looked up with surprise, not expecting this gracious introduction from the younger actor who had so beautifully portrayed Christ. "Thank you," Morgan replied quietly, his distinctive voice carrying more weariness than usual. "And congratulations on your work in The Chosen. You've brought something truly special to that role." They spoke briefly about their shared experience of bringing biblical stories to life, but Jonathan could sense something deeper troubling this legendary figure. He felt that same spiritual prompting from his morning prayer time, urging him to step out in faith with a word of encouragement that seemed to come from beyond his own understanding. Before they parted that day, Jonathan felt led to share something that would prove to be prophetically significant. "Mr. Freeman, I don't know if this means anything to you, but during prayer this morning, I felt strongly impressed to tell someone that God sees their private struggles with doubt and questioning. He's not threatened by honest wrestling, he's drawing close to reveal himself in ways that will transform both their uncertainty and their ministry." Morgan's eyes widened as if those words had struck lightning in his soul. "Call me Morgan," the actor replied, his voice thick with unexpected emotion. "And thank you for saying that. You have no idea how desperately I needed to hear those words today." What Morgan didn't tell Jonathan in that moment was that those words had addressed the exact prayer he had whispered in his car just minutes before entering the breakfast. He had asked God if he could still use someone whose faith was filled with questions and doubts, someone whose private struggles might disqualify them from public ministry. They exchanged contact information, and Morgan mentioned he was facing some difficult decisions about upcoming projects but felt uncertain about moving forward. Jonathan offered to pray about it, sensing God was beginning to weave their paths together for a purpose neither of them could yet comprehend. But what happened next would test both men's faith in ways they never expected, and set in motion the events that would lead to that shocking moment on the Beverly Hills stage 4 months later. Over the following weeks, Morgan and Jonathan began meeting regularly for coffee and prayer, developing a friendship that would soon become the catalyst for the most powerful spiritual breakthrough either man had ever experienced. Morgan finally opened up about the devastating recordings that threatened to destroy his biblical documentary career, while Jonathan listened with the same compassion that had made his portrayal of Christ so beloved worldwide. During one particularly intense conversation at a quiet cafe in Beverly Hills, Morgan revealed the full extent of his crisis. "Jonathan, I'm facing a choice that could end everything," he confessed, his famous voice barely above a whisper. "The network executives are demanding I publicly denounce my private questions about faith, or they'll release the recordings and cancel not just my current project, but potentially blacklist me from any future biblical work." Jonathan leaned forward with gentle intensity, his eyes reflecting the same compassion he brought to his role as Jesus. "Morgan, what if your questions aren't disqualifying you from God's purposes? What if they're actually preparing you for something greater than you've ever imagined? These words began to plant seeds of hope in Morgan's wounded spirit, but the real breakthrough was still to come. One evening during their prayer time together at Morgan's Malibu home, Jonathan experienced something unprecedented in his spiritual life. As they sat in Morgan's study, surrounded by awards and scripts from decades of storytelling, Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of God's presence descending upon the room. The atmosphere became so thick with divine presence that both men could barely speak. Understanding, a message specifically meant for his friend that would prove to be stunningly prophetic. "Morgan," Jonathan said, his voice taking on an unusual authority, "I believe the Lord is showing me that your greatest work isn't behind you, it's directly ahead. He's been allowing this crisis not to destroy you, but to prepare you for a ministry that will reach people who have never been touched by traditional faith messages." Jonathan paused, his eyes closed as if receiving direct revelation. "I see you speaking to audiences of skeptics and questioners, people who have been turned away from faith because they thought doubt was unwelcome. Your honest wrestling with difficult questions will become the very thing that opens doors for others to encounter the living God." Morgan listened with tears streaming down his face, feeling these words penetrate the deepest wounds in his spirit. But Jonathan wasn't finished. "I sense the Lord saying that within 6 months, you'll be standing before the largest audience of your career, not hiding your questions but sharing how God met you in the middle of them. And this will launch something that impacts millions of lives." That conversation marked a complete turning point in Morgan's spiritual journey. He began praying with renewed fervor about his crisis, asking God to show him how to respond to the network's ultimatum. Jonathan continued to pray for his friend regularly, often receiving specific words of encouragement that seemed to come directly from the throne room of heaven. When the Faith and Film Summit organizers approached both men about appearing together on stage to discuss doubt, faith, and authentic storytelling, it seemed like the natural fulfillment of Jonathan's prophetic words. Neither man anticipated that this public appearance would become the exact moment of breakthrough that had been foretold months earlier. But 3 days before the summit, Morgan received another devastating phone call that would test everything he thought he understood about God's faithfulness and timing. The crisis was about to reach its climax, and only a miracle could save his career and his calling. What happened in those final 3 days would set the stage for the most shocking moment of divine intervention that Hollywood had ever witnessed. 3 days before the Faith and Film Summit, Morgan Freeman received the phone call that would either destroy his legacy or become the greatest test of faith in his entire life. The network executive's voice was cold and final. "Morgan, we've decided to release the recordings tomorrow unless you sign this statement denouncing your private comments about Christianity. You have 24 hours to choose between your reputation and your honesty." But there was something else the executive revealed that made Morgan's blood run cold. "We also have recordings of you questioning whether Jesus actually performed miracles, whether the resurrection really happened, and whether Christianity is the only path to God. If these get out, every church, every Christian organization, every faith-based project will abandon you permanently." Morgan hung up the phone and collapsed into his study chair, feeling like his world was crumbling around him. Everything Jonathan had prophesied about a greater ministry seemed impossible now. How could God use someone whose private doubts were about to be exposed to the entire world? That night, Morgan couldn't sleep. He spent hours walking his Malibu property, wrestling with God in a way he hadn't since his youth. "If you're real," he whispered into the darkness, "if you can really use someone like me with all my questions and uncertainties, then you're going to have to show up in a way that leaves no doubt. Because tomorrow, I'm going to lose everything I've worked for." Meanwhile, Jonathan was experiencing the most intense spiritual encounters of his life. For 3 straight nights, he had vivid dreams about standing on a stage next to Morgan, delivering a message that would change both their lives forever. In the dreams, he saw Morgan collapsing, saw thousands of people weeping, and heard himself speaking words he didn't recognize, words that seemed to come directly from the heart of God. On the morning of the summit, Jonathan woke up with specific phrases burning in his spirit. He wrote them down carefully, not understanding their meaning but sensing their crucial importance. "The recordings are not your shame, they're your qualification. Your questions have prepared you to reach the unreachable. What the enemy meant for destruction, God will use for the greatest harvest of your life. That same morning, Morgan made the decision that would change everything. Instead of signing the network statement, he called his lawyer and instructed him to release a brief message to all major news outlets. I will be addressing recent concerns about my faith journey publicly at today's Faith and Film Summit. The recordings, if released, represent only part of a much larger story that I'm ready to share honestly with the world. As Morgan drove to the Beverly Hills venue, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, he had no idea that Jonathan was in his hotel room receiving what he would later describe as the most powerful prophetic download of his entire life. The young actor found himself on his knees, weeping as God gave him specific words, phrases, and insights about his friend's situation that no human being could possibly know. When they met backstage at the summit, Jonathan looked into Morgan's eyes and saw a man standing at the edge of either complete destruction or unprecedented breakthrough. "Morgan," Jonathan said quietly, "I need to share something with you that I believe Jesus wants you to hear. I don't understand it completely, but I know it's meant for this exact moment." What Jonathan shared next would cause Morgan Freeman to collapse on that stage in front of 1,800 people, but it would also launch the most powerful ministry either man had ever imagined. The moment of greatest crisis was about to become the moment of greatest victory, and the entire entertainment industry was about to witness a demonstration of God's power that would be talked about for decades to come. Backstage at the Faith and Film Summit, Jonathan approached Morgan with words that would trigger the most shocking spiritual breakthrough Hollywood had ever witnessed. "Morgan," he said quietly, his voice carrying unusual authority, "I need to share something that I believe Jesus spoke to me about you just this morning." What Jonathan said next defied all human explanation. "The Lord showed me that there are recordings of your private conversations about faith, recordings that someone is threatening to use against you. But He wants you to know that your honest questions about miracles, about the resurrection, about Christianity's claims, these aren't disqualifying you from His purposes. They're actually preparing you for the most important work of your entire life." Morgan's eyes widened in shock. He had never told Jonathan about the recordings. No one outside of the network executives and his lawyer knew the specific content of those private conversations. But Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger as if channeling divine revelation directly. "I see you standing before massive audiences, not just Christian audiences, but skeptics, atheists, people who have given up on faith entirely. Your willingness to wrestle honestly with doubt will become the bridge that brings them to encounter the living God. The very questions that feel like your greatest weakness will become your greatest strength in ministry." Jonathan paused, his eyes closed as if receiving more information. "The Lord is saying that within days, not months, this crisis will transform into the biggest opportunity of your career. The recordings that were meant to destroy you will actually authenticate your message to a generation that's hungry for honest faith conversations." Morgan felt his knees beginning to weaken as each word penetrated deeper into his spirit. This young man was describing details and future scenarios that seemed impossible to know through natural means. "And here's the most specific word," Jonathan continued, his voice almost whisper quiet but carrying tremendous weight. "God showed me that you've been praying about whether He can use someone whose faith includes questions and doubts. The answer is not just yes. It's that He's been orchestrating this entire crisis to position you as the voice that will reach people who think Christianity has no room for honest seekers." At that moment, Morgan knew beyond any shadow of doubt that he was hearing directly from heaven. The phrases Jonathan was using, the specific situations he was addressing, even the timeline he was prophesying, it all perfectly aligned with Morgan's most private prayers and deepest fears. "There's one more thing," Jonathan said, opening his eyes and looking directly at Morgan. "I sense very strongly that you're about to make a public statement that will shock everyone, including yourself. But don't be afraid. What feels like the end of your old ministry is actually the birth of something far greater than you've ever imagined." As they walked toward the stage together, Morgan's heart was pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. Every word Jonathan had spoken resonated with supernatural precision, addressing not just his external crisis but his most intimate spiritual struggles. The moment they stepped into the spotlight, Morgan knew his life was about to change forever. The prophetic words were about to be tested in front of 1,800 people, with cameras rolling and the entire entertainment industry watching. What happened next would either confirm Jonathan as a genuine prophet or destroy both their careers in a single moment of public vulnerability. As Morgan and Jonathan walked onto the Faith and Film Summit stage, the weight of the prophetic words still echoing in Morgan's spirit, neither man was prepared for what would happen next. The 1,800 people in the audience had no idea they were about to witness the most powerful demonstration of God's faithfulness that Hollywood had ever seen. Morgan approached the microphone, but suddenly the same overwhelming presence of God that had filled his study months earlier descended upon the entire auditorium. His knees buckled and he collapsed right there on the stage, the full impact of God's faithfulness crashing over him like a wave. Jonathan rushed to his side as the crowd fell into stunned silence. Dr. Martinez quickly confirmed Morgan's stability while he struggled to regain composure. When Morgan finally stood with Jonathan's help, his voice carried unprecedented authority. What Jonathan shared backstage contained details about my private life that no human being could possibly know, Morgan announced to the captivated audience. 3 days ago, I was given an ultimatum: denounce my private questions about faith or lose everything. Morgan looked directly into the cameras. But instead of hiding my doubts, I'm going to be completely honest about my journey with uncertainty. Because Jonathan was right, my questions aren't disqualifying me from God's purposes. They're preparing me to reach people who think faith has no room for honest seekers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The entire auditorium erupted in spontaneous worship. People were weeping, kneeling, raising hands in praise. The atmosphere became so charged with God's presence that even camera crews struggled to maintain composure. But the most shocking part was still to come. As Morgan spoke, news alerts buzzed throughout the audience. The network executives, watching the live stream and seeing the positive response, had just announced their decision to not only restore Morgan's documentary series but expand it into the largest faith-based media project in television history. Jonathan's prophecy about within days, not months, was being fulfilled in real time. What the enemy meant for destruction, God had transformed into the greatest harvest of Morgan's career. The moment that began with collapse had become a demonstration of resurrection power. 6 months after that shocking moment on stage, Morgan Freeman's expanded documentary series, Voices of Faith, Honest Questions, became the most watched religious programming in television history. His authentic approach to addressing doubt and spiritual wrestling reached millions who had given up on traditional faith messages, sparking the largest wave of adult conversions in decades. Churches across America began hosting Honest Faith discussion groups based on Morgan's transparent testimony. Pastors reported that people who had been avoiding church for years were suddenly showing up, saying they finally found a place where questions were welcome alongside faith. Jonathan and Morgan's friendship deepened into a brotherhood that would impact the entertainment industry for years to come. They began speaking together at conferences worldwide, demonstrating how God uses authentic relationships and prophetic obedience to accomplish impossible breakthroughs. The recordings that were meant to destroy Morgan's career became the foundation of his most powerful ministry. His willingness to be vulnerable about spiritual struggles gave permission for millions of others to bring their own questions into the light, where they could encounter the God who isn't threatened by honest seeking. Looking back on that day when Morgan collapsed after receiving God's confirmation through Jonathan's obedient words, both men marveled at divine timing. The moment of greatest vulnerability had become a demonstration of God's power to transform crisis into calling. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that God doesn't waste our struggles. He uses them as bridges to reach others who are walking similar paths. Sometimes our most painful seasons are actually preparation for our most fruitful ministry. So as you reflect on this remarkable story of friendship, faith, and divine timing, ask yourself, are you willing to be honest about your spiritual questions and struggles? Are you open to how God might use your own journey, including the doubt and uncertainty, to help others find their way? And are you listening for His voice through the believers He has placed in your life? God is still speaking, still working through our authentic relationships and honest conversations about faith. He wants to use your story, questions, and all as part of his incredible plan to reach a world hungry for authentic encounters with his love. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more inspiring testimonies of God's faithfulness, and share in the comments how he has used your own questions and struggles as part of your faith journey.